So I'm delighted for us now to be joined by Dr Emily Shuckburgh, renowned climate scientist and communicator, director of Cambridge Zero, and also, crucially, a friend of COP26. So in other words, someone who's there to help the UK presidency try and smooth through and make sure the COP is productive. So Emily, thanks so much for joining us today. Emily, just remind us that this whole COP has been framed around the need to try and keep 1.5 alive. Why is that important?
Oh, listener, it's critically important. We've already seen the impacts of climate change affecting lives and livelihoods around the world. Last few months, wildfires, floods, storm damage, really devastating communities. And that's when we're at 1.1 or so degrees of warming. As we edge up towards 1.5, and worse still if we get above 1.5 degrees, then we will start to be in a world that we just do not recognise. We know that as you move between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming, we risk hundreds of millions of additional people being exposed to the impacts of climate change and poverty. And in terms of the natural world, it's literally the difference between extinction or not just of species, but of entire ecosystems. At 2 degrees, we may have no coral reefs left on the world. That's what it means. The other real concern, I spent a huge amount of time studying the polar regions, that's my own personal research area. We're at risk of passing tipping points from which we cannot return. So in terms of the polar ice sheets, those vast ice sheets covering Greenland and West Antarctica, we may find that we pass a tipping point beyond which they no longer exist and would eventually lead to many metres of sea level rise, transforming global coastlines.
And so it's very worrying. I mean, are we on track yet or anywhere close to trying to keep global temperatures to 1.5?
I wish I could say yes, but the answer is no. We're not. The pledges that are being put forward this week from countries around the world are simply not sufficient. We needed to be halving global emissions by 2030, and the pledges are not even doing a fraction of that. So it's welcome that we've started to see a direction of travel, not just from countries, but in terms of the businesses of the world as well, towards net zero. But that trajectory is not happening fast enough. And so the only hope that's currently now being pinned on is on the idea that we'll come back next year and hopefully then with renewed, more ambitious pledges that put us in the right direction.
Now, so much of the focus of this COP26 has been on net zero and the need to try and have a focus on that for both companies and governments likewise. It's almost been talked about as if it's a destination, but is that correct?
No, it's absolutely not. This is the scale of the challenge, is that not only do we need to be reaching net zero by around about the middle of the century in terms of our global emissions, but any of the trajectories that take us to a world that keeps temperatures below 1.5 degrees with a reasonable chance, they go below zero afterwards. So we need to be actually taking carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. We've already put too much into the atmosphere. Now, the good news is that not only do we have technologies that are being developed in order to do that, but we have nature which does it for us in any case. So if only we could be looking to better support, protect and indeed restore our natural worlds, then we restore the natural life systems that do precisely some of the things that we need to do. Now, none of that can be at the expense of really rapid emissions reductions, but nature can be helping us here if only we looked to actually treat it with the respect it deserves.
So how are you feeling about the COP then? I mean, like we're on the penultimate day, really, officially. Sometimes these things run over, of course, but officially the penultimate day. How do you feel overall it's gone to date? And, are you feeling optimistic, pessimistic, or is it pretty much as perhaps you thought it might end up being anyway?
I feel a really bizarre combination of optimism and pessimism. So from a scientific perspective, as I just described, we are not on course to limit the worst impacts of climate change. I was at one of the things that they've had here is this Arctic base camp where there was an iceberg brought from the Arctic, and when I arrived last Wednesday it was this magnificent edifice, and when I saw it yesterday it was just a sort of slightly soggy ice cube, and I felt that that scale of melts was somehow symbolic of the world melting as rather little action was happening at a global scale. So on that side I feel quite pessimistic, but where I feel more optimistic is actually in terms of some of the other things things that we've heard around at COP26 in terms of the innovations, in terms of the solutions that are being developed and could be deployed at scale to actually create a better world, a world with less pollution, a world with richer nature and biodiversity, a world that is more equal. That's where I have optimism. We're not on track at the moment, but there are signs that we could be.
And you and I have both been to many COPs over the years and followed this issue for a long time. A huge frustration I've long had, I know you as well, is that for too long the climate and nature issues have been talked about as if they're separate issues somehow. It feels to me, for the first time, there's a lot more join up between those issues here. And this feels to me like it's been a COP26 has had more discussion about nature than any previous COP. Do you think we're finally getting there and people realising how closely these issues are linked?
Oh no, I think you're absolutely right. Nature has been absolutely central to this COP in so many different ways, and rightly so, because not only can nature help us in terms of those emissions reductions, it also helps provide resilience to so many of the impacts of climate change, whether that's in terms of flood defences or other protective systems of the natural world. So it is absolutely central, and it's absolutely essential that as our nature is under threat, that we look at ways of both protecting nature and of addressing the climate challenge.
Well, that's a message that the Wildlife Trust will strongly agree with for sure. Dr Emily Shuckburgh, thank you so much for speaking to the Wildlife Trust today.